So I noticed recently that I've been keeping track of the books that I read. Actually, not the books that I read, the books that I finish. Because I have a tendency not to finish books because if I have very little patience for bad books, and I'll quit at any point. I could be like 75% of the way through a book. If I don't enjoy it, I don't finish it and I'll stop. But anyways, I do keep track of the ones I finish, and I've kept track for like 10 years, and I decided, hey, why don't I sort these by nonfiction and the stars and see which ones are the best, and then I'll pick the top 10. So that's what I did, and here's my list. I'm going to share my top 10, and then because I want to include a bunch of other ones, I'm going to do a bunch of quick honorable mentions, but I'm not going to go into detail. But the top 10 I will say a few words about and let you know why I enjoyed it, and maybe you'll get some ideas about things that you want to read. I did not include any graphic novels, which I read a lot of, and I did not include any fiction, but I still had like 600 books. But I don't read that much actually. It's more that I don't know. They just accumulate like audiobooks and yeah, other stuff. So whatever. Here they are, my top 10, and yeah, these are pretty great books. The first three are books that I reread, and I thought, if they're good enough to reread, they must be pretty good books. So yeah, I think these are three of my favorites. So the first, The Medium, is The Massage by Marshall McLuhan. I've talked about this book before in my James Joyce Ulysses videos, because Ulysses and Joyce was such a big influence on McLuhan. And I think McLuhan is often seen as this really impenetrable and difficult to read guy, but I think this book is an exception. It's illustrated, it's very short. You can read it in like under 2 hours easily, probably under an hour, I don't know. But it's a great book, very accessible and very fun, and I really like it. I think it's a great place to start with McLuhan. And then the next book that I reread is called Food of the Gods by Terence McKenna. It's a book about the history of drug use in different cultures around the world and how that use has affected cultures and the direction of our entire planet, really, including things like tobacco, alcohol, marijuana, cocaine, all these other things, psychedelics, of course. That was McLuhan's big thing. But I think my favorite McLuhan book is probably True Hallucinations, but I haven't reread that in the last 10 years, I guess, because it was not on the list. But both books are very good, and good places to start if you've never read Terence McKenna, who's probably more well known nowadays as for his talks, which have kind of proliferated in the YouTube and file sharing era. But I think his books are also pretty good. The Food of the Gods, though, is it's more like a cultural study rather than True Hallucinations, which is more like a memoir and more literary. So anyways, very good book. And then the next one is also a book I reread. It's called, I read a lot of, well, no, I don't read a lot, but I read sometimes kind of personal development, self-help books, or whatever you want to call them. And some are really good, some are really bad. But this one I would say is my favorite because I've read it at least a few times, listened to the audiobook. And it's just like a really good overview of ideas that you can go to for personal development and just kind of start. And it has a lot of book recommendations within it, but it's called The Success Principles by Jack Canfield. And it is pretty good sized book, like 500 pages. It just has a lot of exercises, a lot of ideas. I think wherever you're at in life, it's a great book to kind of help you get unstuck with your health, your relationships, your money, your whatever you're doing with your career or your studies. All that it can be addressed in this book, and it's a great place to start. So yeah, Success Principles. Now we're looking at the books that I haven't reread, but I just liked, and these are my favorites, I guess, of the last 10 years. So this biography is probably my favorite biography, possibly my favorite biography that I've ever read. And it's Beethoven, a biography of Beethoven by Jan Swafford, who's written some wonderful classical music books. He has another one called, what's it called? It's like a general history of classical music. I'll come, actually I don't remember it, but I'll put it here because it's really good. Yeah, so that's a great book about music. Actually, again, that's not really specific just to musicians. It's just a general biography, and I think he's a really interesting character, and a lot of interesting things happen. You should probably stop and listen to the music as they're referenced in the book. Another book, though, that I loved that is also about music, but the 20th century, is called The Rest is Noise by Alex Ross. And I've talked about this guy before. I did a review of his book, Wagnerism, which is also great. But I think The Rest is Noise is much more essential and much more just if you're interested at all in music history, you got to read it because I think that Jan Swafford book about the history of classical music is great. It gets you to the 20th century, and then this book kind of picks up where that leaves off, and it just takes it in a totally new direction because the 20th century was just such an explosion of different musical forms and creativity. So yeah, I forgot to include this one when I was recording, but this biography of Shakespeare is probably the best book about Shakespeare that I've read. And as a biography of Shakespeare, there's only so much information that we actually have. There's a lot of guesswork in any biography of Shakespeare. But because of that, Peter Ackroyd, who's written a lot about London and England and literary history and history in general of England, he really situates Shakespeare in his era and uses that to kind of provide some guesswork and information about what we might know about Shakespeare. And I thought it was just fascinating, and I think it's probably, the best book I've read about Shakespeare, so check it out. Next book, I mentioned James Joyce, and this book is actually about James Joyce and how Ulysses came to be published. It's called The Most Dangerous Book, and if you're interested at all in James Joyce or literature, modern literature, you got to read this book. It is just I've talked about this before, how incredible it is that we even have Ulysses as a book. It's just so many obstacles to James Joyce's, money problems, his health problems, and then the problems of getting it published and reaching a public that would be appreciative of it. It's just incredible that it was able to be absorbed by our culture, but it was, and this book kind of chronicles how that happened. There's other books, about Joyce. The Ellman biography is also pretty essential, but this one I liked a lot. It's more recent. All right, next book is kind of a science-y book. It's called Why We Sleep. And again, I've talked about this book because it was just so fascinating to learn about how I'm always interested in the brain and how it works. So this has a lot about memory and the brain and things like that. So I think everybody, because we all sleep, is interested in sleep, and we'll find things within this book that are very interesting. So check it out. And another book related to learning and things like that is How We Learn by Stanislaus Dehaene. And this book is more technical. It can get pretty technical. And I would like to read more books by this guy. I haven't, unfortunately, but one of these days I will start to read his other books because he writes about things like reading and math and just general learning processes, which, as I've said, they fascinate me. All right, moving on to, am I already at 10? Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yeah, this is 10. So this is the last of the official 10, because I know the internet loves lists, and then I'll jump into my honorable mentions that I'll just briefly enumerate. And if you want, more book recommendations, my Goodreads, I'll put a link down below, and you can check out my other book recommendations. And like I said, I don't necessarily read a lot of books, but sometimes I do. I don't write reviews. I just give stars, but that's enough to get you started. If it's 4 or 5 stars, that means it's either a book that I would reread or that I really want to reread at some point in the future. So those are the books that I recommend the most. So the last book that I'm going to recommend is called High Weirdness. And this book was pretty interesting. It kind of touches on 3 authors and cultural figures of especially the 1970s. Terence McKenna, who I mentioned before, Robert Anton Wilson, and Philip K. Dick. And they're all, it's by this guy, Eric Davis. It's a really thick, thick in size, but also thick in just ideas. And I could only read it so quickly because it was just so packed with ideas and things to think about. Eric Davis is a great writer, one of my favorite nonfiction writers. So if you're all interested in high weirdness, as the title says, check out this book, because basically all 3 of those characters, Wilson, McKenna, and Philip K. Dick, had sort of, like, I don't know what you want to call them, sort of unusual experiences, out-of-body experiences or contact experiences or whatever, and they wrote about them in different ways. And that's kind of what Eric Davis is looking at. It's like, why did this all happen at this time among these characters, and what does it all mean? So that's my list of the top 10. Let me just blaze now through a bunch of other books that I liked that I wrote down. So my very first book review, this book was a very fat one, Sex, Ecology, Spirituality by Ken Wilber. It's not a book I would reread, I don't think, because I don't think his writing's that good, but his ideas and the way that he puts ideas together are really incredible, and I think it's a really good philosophy book. Science of Mind, I kind of like reading stuff like that sometimes. I read that book. The Magic of Thinking Big, it's kind of a book thinking big. I would like to reread that, actually. That's a kind of an old school self-help book, and it's kind of, I think it's pretty short if I remember correctly, but it was very good. Now, I mentioned biography of Shakespeare. The other one that I liked is Bill Bryson's. I think it's just called Shakespeare, The World is Stage or something. But yeah, pretty good. Bill Bryson, I don't think he's a great writer. I think he's just a writer that, everybody can read because he writes so simply. But I think it's a pretty good biography or story of Shakespeare. The Varieties of Religious Experience by William James. This is the only book I've read by William James, and at some point I want to read through his psychology book, but I did enjoy The Varieties of Religious Experience. Sort of an autobiography, but in the form of like a personal development book. It's called Get Off Your Butt by Sean Stevenson. He was one of my favorite sort of public speakers. When I was studying public speaking, I would watch his videos because he had such a difficult life. He had a lot of health problems. He was in a wheelchair all his life, and he died pretty young, like 40 or so. And when I watch his videos, and they're very inspirational, they give me a lot of ideas. But his autobiography is pretty good as well. And then I don't think I was able to include. Yeah, I didn't include Tim Wu's books, but both of his books I liked a lot. The Master Switch and The Attention Merchants, I believe it's called. They're both, I would say he's one of my favorite nonfiction writers, talking about sort of technologies and corporations. Very good writing. Sapiens by, I forget his name. I don't have it in front of me. Yuval Harari, I believe. That was kind of a book that was a bestseller. It's been translated into so many languages, like almost as many languages as the Bible. Like I see it in so many languages, translations. But it's a good book. It has, it's been criticized. I didn't follow the criticism too much, but it's a good book. And the sequel, Homo Deus, is pretty good too. I think he has a few other books, but I think those are the best books by him I've read. And then Carl Safina wrote a great book about animals called Beyond Words. And then there was another book about kind of animals related that I liked a lot, An Immense World by Ed Yong. Really good book. And then another book about nature that I liked, about mushrooms and things like that, Entangled Life. Very good, very well written. I'd like to read books by that guy again. And then I mentioned Jan Swafford's Beethoven book. The other biography he wrote of of Mozart, is also very good. And I would like to read, I think he wrote a book about, who was it? Brahms? But Jan Swafford's just such a great writer, though, about music. And then a book about psychedelics that, what's his name? It's called How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan. That was pretty good. Another great neuroscience book that I forgot to mention was Livewired by David Eagleman. And I think those are the main nonfiction books of the last 10 years that I've enjoyed most. So what about you? What have been some of your most favoritist nonfiction books? Oh, you know what? One other book I just remembered that I didn't write down, The Perennial Philosophy, is an anthology. Aldous Huxley, I believe, edited it. And it's a very good book. I don't know why I didn't write that down, but I meant to. So anyways, let me know if you have any nonfiction recommendations, or if you think based on my list, there's other books that I gotta read. And I'll do one of these for fiction, or like I said, I don't read as much fiction, but I do read fiction sometimes. And maybe for graphic novels, I do read a lot of graphic novels, so that'd be an idea for a list. So yeah, see you in the future top 10 video, maybe, perhaps, who knows.